Okay, I'm not gonna close it, but I'm gonna minimize that because I don't need that. Okay, hi, welcome to Lowriders. I'm Zach Quinones. This is my voice good? Cool. Uh, Another video. We're still figuring out the rhythm of this intro and the outro, so just bear with us. But what I'm going to talk about is from this book, Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan and Beyond by Robin Wood. Yeah, it was Robin Wood. I didn't. So anyways, this book is really great. I'll put a link in the description. Got you there, Mike. And it's going to be, probably like Amazon or something like that where you can buy the book. It's a fucking awesome book. Absolutely awesome book. I'm not a big fan of like film history books, surprisingly. I'm not a big fan of any like film books per se, but this one is really, really good. It's very specific in the topics that it discusses. So I'm going to kind of, in a very dumber way, talk about one of the things that it dives into. So one of it is classic narration or classic cinema. And one of the movies that it kind of focuses on is Raging Bull and also some of Hitchcock films, which would be considered more post-classical cinema or classic narrative, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to define a little bit of what classic narrative is. Again, this is a very dumbed down version. Okay, so use me as a platform, buy the book, and then you'll get a much more intelligent take on this. But this is kind of to get you guys rolling, and ladies, and everything in between. So classic narrative essentially follows like classic film cinema from like the 1910s to about the 1960s, in which everything follows a sort of traditional setting or expectation. One of the things that it talks about, like sort of like the patriarchal structure of things, like the man is the hero, the woman is the one in need, and the order ends up being very traditional in terms of American standards and traditions as far as like from beginning, middle to end. Guy gets girl, yada yada. You get the point of what I'm saying. So what the author does is kind of dive into this kind of post-classical narrative, and that kind of challenges those things. But I wanted to fast forward it even more to a modern take on this. So in the book, I'm going to do my best here. So what it talks about is three particular things of classical narrative, which is order, tone, and identification. Order being, again, the author talks about the sort of patriarchal structure of things and what you consider that to be traditional. If you want to do a very, very watered down version of it in terms of American lifestyle, man goes to work, woman stays home, takes care of the kids. Just think of it that way in terms of order in cinema. Casablanca. Okay, so that's like a good one. Tone. The tone of sort of like a resolution where everything feels it's in order. So the tone is sort of complementing the order and vice versa. The other one is identification. Again, this goes back to kind of order where the way the audience identifies female characters and male characters matches with the order of classical narrative or traditional American views. So what the author is kind of challenging is looking at films that, not challenging, pondering on and studying is films that challenge that. They use Hitchcock and Scorsese's Raging Bull, but Hitchcock sort of how his, I think it's Vertigo. Doesn't matter because that's not the movies I'm going to use, for example. The movie I'm going to use is Gone Girl. So Gone Girl takes the order of sort of the classical marriage and really inverts it in and takes it on its head where it's very chaotic. There is no order, really. Then it goes into tone. The tone of the film, it kind of has this paradoxical, is that a word? Is that paradoxical, right? Okay. Has a has a paradoxical feel to it because spoiler alert, they get back together at the end. So if you haven't seen Gone Girl, this is your own fault because it's a great movie and it's been around for long enough. Gone Girl is Ben Affleck and shit, I cannot remember her name and I'm going to look it up because it's important. So give me a second here. Gone. There we go. 2014. So you've had 8 years. Rosamund Pike. So Rosamund Pike and Ben Affleck are married. They have like quote unquote the perfect marriage. I'll just go ahead and close this because I don't need it anymore. And they end up not divorcing, but their marriage falls apart. And as the movie progresses, it unravels of how it falls apart. Ben Affleck was cheating on her. She went off the deep end, and to get back to him, she faked her own murder, framed it on Ben Affleck. And I'm going to refer to them as their actor names in this movie. And over the course of the movie, about halfway through, it's shown that she faked her murder. It completely inverts the narrative on its head, and you actually get her narration and her perspective for the movie from that point on, essentially. And she goes through how she faked her murder and disappearance and how she framed her husband. And ultimately from there, the narrative then begins to come back to a resolution where they actually get back together and their marriage is saved. Now, going back to tone, you should feel a sense of easiness and comfort because that's the traditional classic narrative. But what Gone Girl does is it gives you that traditional ending, but because of the circumstances and context behind it, the tone is inverted. You don't feel easy because you know how toxic, chaotic, and how fucked up these two people are in the head, especially Rosamund Pike's character. Essentially, her mindset is, I'm doing this to show him how much I love him. And she does some wild shit through the movie. Obviously, she faked her murder. She kills somebody in the movie. So it's just like a very, like, you get the traditional ending. You get the classical narrative just on the surface level if you missed all the details. But it leaves the audience with a weird tone. It's an uneasiness. It doesn't feel right. It feels discomforting. Something that Scorsese and Hitchcock kind of really pushed in that post-classical era. Now the identification thing is, Rosamund Pike isn't the traditional wife. Far from it. She doesn't fulfill a traditional role or a role in the classic narrative. So right then and there, it challenges, again, the identification of both those roles. And as the author explains, it kind of goes back to sort of challenging or deconstructing sort of the patriarchal structure within classic narrative film. And ultimately, when you really look at it, Ben Affleck becomes very much the submissive person because at the end of the film, it's almost as if, well, I might as well stay with this crazy bitch because if I don't, I know what's going to happen. And so he sort of submits to this whole thing and they both end up happy. It's a really weird, but it's because of their happiness is rooted in this weird, just chaotic relationship. Again, it goes back to the tone. It leaves people discomforting. And on a side note, it's very interesting because a lot of couples that went to go see that movie got into a lot of fights because, I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory. But I think that's a very interesting thing, especially when you're approaching screenwriting, is looking at sort of what do I want to do in terms of the narrative? Do I want to stick with a classical narrative or do I want to do more post-classical? And depending on which one you choose, if you can understand sort of the DNA of a classical narrative versus post-classical, it's going to help you progress through the story that you're writing to be more consistent with what you're doing. Because the worst thing you can do, a lot of people, they'll go into a post-classical narrative without really being conscious of it, and then it will deter into a more classical narrative. And that's where you get a lot of situations where you read scripts and you feel like they're two different movies or they're two different scripts, and not in the good way. Because you can get that feeling where the first half and the second half feels like two different films, but it works. You know, Full Metal Jacket is like a prime example of that. The first half, it just feels like two fucking different movies, but it works so well. But even in that movie, he follows a very, we'd have to look into that movie and see really what kind of narrative structure or narrative system Kubrick works in. But this is something that a lot of writers overlook. A lot of times when we go into writing, we do the right things in terms of, oh, good character, good plot. Let me figure out act one, act two, act three. But this is just another layer that I think will be really, really valuable to consider when it comes to, you know, the sort of order, tone, and identification of the system, whether it's a patriarchal system or matriarchal system. You can go into that if you really want to get deep into it. So that's something I want each of you to kind of consider on the most recent scripts you've written. Like really ask yourself, am I following a classic narrative structure here? Or am I more post-classical? Or maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of mixing it all up. And if you're mixing it all up, that's going to probably help you figure out like which one should I do. And it really does change the entire dynamic of the story. Because if you look at Gone Girl, and if it chose to go with a more classical narrative, it's an entirely different film. Even if it ends the same, it's an entirely different film. So again, the book is Hollywood from Vietnam to Reagan and Beyond by Robin Wood. Link is going to be in the description. You want to like, subscribe, comment, and what was the other one?
Ring the bell.
And ring the bell. We're working on the outro. I'm working on segueing from finishing the topic I'm talking about into that. It's a very rough segue. If I was a gymnast, I would have ran into the little fucking thing that they jump off of. But yeah, so do that. Links in the description, which I've said about 18 fucking times because that's Mike's main note for me. And then yeah, check out our writing workshops and more videos to come. So see you guys next time.